Okay, right. Okay, welcome everyone to the latest installment in the Crown and Commonwealth series of speaker events. This one is about the Chagos Islands controversy. This is brought to you by the Toronto branch of the Royal Commonwealth Society, or RCS. And the RCS is an independent, volunteer-based, inclusive association that promotes education, discussion, research, and public awareness about the Commonwealth of Nations and Canada's role in this multifaceted global alliance. Our Crown and Commonwealth series aims to highlight timely and relevant geostrategic issues facing Commonwealth countries. In April of this year, we focused on the Guyana-Venezuela territorial dispute, featuring the High Commissioner for Guyana, His Excellency Keith George, and the former Canadian Ambassador to Venezuela, Ben Rouswell. And you can learn more about us at our website, rcstoronto.ca. Okay. Okay, so today we are honored and very privileged to have two experts on the Chagos Islands issue with us, right? And they are Olivier Bancoult and Professor James Ker-Lindsay. And I will now give you their brief biographies. I'll start with Professor Ker-Lindsay first, because he'll be speaking first. Professor Dr. James Ker-Lindsay is a visiting professor at the University of Kent. Before this, he spent many years at the London School of Economics. His focus is on secession and state recognition in international politics. His latest book, Secession and State Creation: What Everyone Needs to Know, was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. In addition to his academic work, he has considerable policy experience and has advised the British government, the United Nations, and the Council of Europe. Okay. Now living in Cyprus, he also runs a YouTube channel on international relations, conflict, and security. So you can go to YouTube and search for the channel of James Ker-Lindsay. Okay, so he'll be providing the geopolitical issues on this controversy. And we also have with us Louis-Olivier Bancoult to provide the Chagosian point of view. Louis-Olivier Bancoult is a Chagosian activist for the right of return, and he's also the leader of the Chagos Refugee Group, or CRG. He was born in 1964 on the island of Paros Banhos in the Chagos Archipelago, or Chagos Islands, from where he was forcibly removed at the age of 4 and transported to Mauritius. In response, his mother, Rita Elise Bancoult, together with activists Charlesia Alexis and Lisette Talat, founded the Chagos Refugees Group in 1982. Olivier Bancoult is an electrician and an advocate for the judicial right of the Chagosians to return from Mauritius to their original homeland. He has been involved in several high-profile legal actions concerning the exile of the Chagos Islanders. He was one of 5 islanders who, on the 13th of February 2022, stepped onto the beach of Paros Banhos, one of the larger atolls making up the occupied Chagos Islands. And he was able to do that due to Mauritius's legal victories, first at the United Nations General Assembly, then at the United Nations International Court of Justice, and then at the UN's International Tribunal for Law of the Seas. In 2023, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, along with Lisette Elise, a Chagosian woman who testified before the International Court of Justice in the case of Mauritius versus the United Kingdom. Right, so those are our two speakers. I'll now show a map of the Indian Ocean with the Chagos Islands in the middle. And you can see that its closest neighbors are the Maldives to the north, the Seychelles to the west, and Mauritius to the southwest. Right? And there's a lot of distance between these islands in the Indian Ocean. There's a brief history. Mauritius, the Seychelles, and the Chagos Islands all came under British control in the 19th century. And for most of the 19th century, they were all administered as part of the colony of Mauritius, but Seychelles was split off as a separate colony around 1903. In 1965, during negotiations for the independence of Mauritius, the UK separated the Chagos Islands from Mauritius, and it also separated Aldabra, Fakar, and Desroches from Seychelles and put them into a new British overseas territory or colony called the British Indian Ocean Territory. Now, why would the UK do that? Well, the answer became obvious between 1967 and 1973, when the UK deported between 1,400 and 2,000 people from the Chagos Islands in order to build the military base on Diego Garcia. And in 1968, Mauritius became independent without the Chagos Islands. In 1971, the United States leased Diego Garcia from the UK for its military base. In 1976, the Seychelles became independent, and the UK ceded Aldabra, Fakar, and Desroches back to Seychelles, but the Chagos Islands stayed in the British Indian Ocean Territory. From the 1980s onward, Mauritius has claimed the Chagos Islands, and Chagosians began to petition for the right to return to their homeland. Between 2017 and 2019, there were United Nations General Assembly resolutions and an International Court of Justice decision ordering the UK to return the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, and I believe also for the right of return for the Chagosians. Negotiations between the UK and Mauritius began afterwards, and in 2024, the UK and Mauritius agreed to cede the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius, but with the UK keeping a 99-year lease on Diego Garcia. That is the largest island of Chagos, where the US military base is. No treaty or law has been passed yet to put this agreement in effect, and the Chagosians still have no right to return home, unfortunately. Okay, so let's see. And that's, I have to figure out how to not share screen. Stop share. All right, so I will now call upon James Ker-Lindsay to give his remarks on the Chagos Islands. So Dr. Ker-Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Derwin, and thank you to the Society for this very, very kind invitation. As you mentioned, I'm talking to you from Cyprus, which actually has a remarkably close link to this case for reasons I'll make clear in a little while. Thanks also for giving a brief overview of the history. In many ways, I was sort of worrying a little bit because there would be rather a lot to get in. And I was thinking, how am I going to cover all of this? But I think you've done a great job in presenting this. But, just to recap, I mean, it's a fascinating story in many ways. I would imagine that few viewers have ever been to Mauritius. I had the good fortune probably about 12 years ago to go, and it was a really interesting experience. But what I found really interesting was that a few years ago, I had a chance to go to St. Lucia, which is probably somewhere where a few more members might have been. There were lots of Canadians. And they actually have a parallel history because they were both effectively taken by Britain from France at the same time and then ceded by France after the Napoleonic Wars to Britain. So in many ways, this explains why it's rather anomalous that despite 200 years of British colonial rule, French is still the dominant sort of language in both places. But what obviously, as you mentioned, was interesting is that the Chagos Islands were taken at the same time as Mauritius and Seychelles and put within essentially a single British colony. And then the Seychelles were parted off at the start of the 20th century, and the Chagos Islands and Mauritius continued to be under British rule. But of course, after the Second World War, we had the period of British decolonization, and Mauritius, like so many other territories, including Cyprus, was pressing very heavily for independence. And it was at this point that, as you alluded to, Britain effectively decided, well, what the plan was to do was say to Mauritius, you can have your independence, but we need to keep this bit of territory. And it was very obvious what the purpose of that was. As you mentioned, it was to create this very important airbase. And I think many of the members will be very aware of Diego Garcia as one of the most important US air bases in the world. If you look at where it is in the middle of the Indian Ocean, I mean, and draw an arc, you cover everything from Southeast Asia across South Asia and over to East Africa. It's an enormous area that can be reached. And Diego Garcia was incredibly important, for example, in operations in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. And so it created this very clear incentive for Britain and the United States not to be seen to be giving up the base. And I'm not going to talk about the plight of the Chagos Islanders themselves, because I think obviously this is something that Olivier will cover and will do it far more eloquently and, you know, with the real much greater insight into exactly what they went through. But they were forced from the island. But at the same time, Mauritius made the claim that even though it had received compensation, and I mean a paltry sum, and I don't mean to be flippant or whatever, but it's almost as though for anyone who remembers the Austin Powers film, when you know, the lead bad guy asks for a sum of money and says $1 million, and everyone just bursts out laughing because it's so paltry by today's standards. But in fact, Mauritius was paid £3 million for the Chagos Islands, which is, you know, it seems ridiculously small by today's standards. It was actually fairly small by standards then, if one really takes it into account. So Mauritius had really been pressing this for a number of years. It had built up a lot of support amongst African countries. And then what we saw was that it was able to bring the matter before the General Assembly in June 2017 to ask for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. And essentially, it asked two very specific questions. So the first question was the decolonization of Mauritius lawfully completed in 1968, so when Mauritius became independent, after the separation of the Chagos archipelago? And the second question arising from that was, what are the consequences of the UK's continued administration of the Chagos archipelago, including the inability of Mauritius to resettle its nationals on the islands? And the court came back a couple of years later with a decision that was a huge defeat for the UK. Effectively, it made two specific points. The first was that it said that the Mauritius leaders had been unable to take a free and fair decision. Effectively, it said that they were coerced into accepting the separation of the Chagos Islands as a condition of their independence. And so after that, the second point that effectively the court made was that also the decision to separate the Chagos Islands was actually contrary to international law. And this hinged on a very, very important UN General Assembly resolution from December 1960, Resolution 1514, which dealt with decolonization. And one of the things it said very clearly was that in the process of decolonization, colonial powers should not separate off territories and retain those territories, especially not for military use. And so this was a very important finding in many ways. And it was then taken back to the General Assembly later that year and overwhelmingly voted against Britain. So the British initial reaction to this was, look, this is just an advisory opinion. It wasn't taken under the compulsory jurisdiction of the court. This was not something that the UN could enforce on Britain, especially as the General Assembly has essentially said, Britain, you've got 6 months to vacate the islands. And Britain just said, look, that's not going to happen. But I think what we saw is that in the years that followed, it dawned on the UK that it couldn't just ignore this. And, you know, remembering, of course, Britain is a P5 member of the UN, it holds this position. It makes respect for international law front and center of its foreign policy. And it just really didn't look particularly good to have a UN resolution clearly against it, based on an International Court of Justice opinion. Now, even if, as I say, it was an advisory opinion, it was still very powerfully argued. And so Britain then started these negotiations. And this is what we saw essentially a couple of months ago with the announcement from the new Labour government in Britain that it had reached an agreement. Now, as I say, many of your viewers will probably be aware of the howls of outrage that we saw of this in the UK. And I think that 2 points I'd make on that is, first and foremost, it was very easy for members, and it was essentially on the political right, to argue that this had been Labour selling out the UK as one of the first and most major foreign policy decisions of the government. But of course, the negotiations had been going on for several years, and it was quite clear that even had the Conservative government won, they were committed to this path. And secondly, I mean, there was howls of outrage from people who you can be sure that 90% of them the day before had no clue about the Chagos Islands, where they were, what they did. It was just one of these things that had come up, and it was Britain selling out. But I think what underlies a lot of this angst is the question of what sort of impact this is going to have on other British non-self-governing territories, as the UN effectively calls colonies these days. And I think this is an important question because there was a lot of issues that arose about whether this would mean opening the gates for the Falkland Islands to become independent or join with Argentina, I should say. I was about to say return to Argentina, but I think that's a little bit simplistic. It's much more complicated than that. Happy to talk about that in the Q&A, of course. And then in Gibraltar as well, which has another thing. But in reality, it has no bearing on either case. What made the Chagos Island case very, specific was the fact that it hinged on this particular resolution, Resolution 1514, about separating off territories. And this is where Cyprus really comes into it. So it's sort of dark here, and even if I had my window open, I could actually sort of point, I'm sitting probably about half a kilometre to 800 metres away from one of the sovereign-based areas in Cyprus. And it was very telling that the Cypriot government had kept a very close eye on this case. And in actual fact, when it came before the International Court, Cyprus took part in the proceedings because Cyprus has argued, and essentially, there is something to the argument that the same thing had happened in its case, that when Cyprus was effectively granted the right to independence by Britain in 1959, part of the agreement had been that Britain would retain 99 square miles of territory. I should know that in kilometres, but anyway, 99 square miles of territory. And there were a number of other sites which have since subsequently been given back to the Republic. But these were sovereign base areas. And so the Republic of Cyprus has the argument that it also could make this case. Now, there's no immediate sign that it will. And matters are complicated by the fact, and for anyone who's a lawyer in the audience, they'll know how important this is. But when it comes to international law, any law, precision is everything. And Cyprus became independent before the resolution was passed. And in many ways, the language of the resolution was probably shaped by Cypriot independence and the fact that Britain had retained these base areas. But it does mean that if it was brought before the court, then we could potentially be in a very different circumstance. So it doesn't necessarily lead to the fact that what we saw happen in Mauritius will necessarily lead on to Cyprus. But of all the British remaining overseas territories, this is the one that has the most obvious link to what we've seen. I won't go into much more details because I pass the floor to Olivier, but I would say that there is obviously one extra element in all of this which is important, fascinating, however you approach it, which is obviously the question of the Chagos Islanders themselves and what happens with the Chagosians, because this has effectively handed the Chagos Islands to Mauritius and naturally assumed that the Chagos Islanders are now Mauritian citizens, and that it's for Mauritius to decide on their future. And I think, it'll be interesting to hear from Olivier how the Chagos Islanders themselves feel about this, what their particular perspective is. Maybe we can go into the Q&A about some of the issues that arise from this, because there are actually some quite important and interesting legal questions that come up from this, which would seem to suggest that, however the Chagos Islanders feel, that this is probably their right to independence probably doesn't extend, but I'll happily go into more in that in the Q&A. But I think I'll leave it there, just to give a bit of an overview as to what the case was, what it hinged on, and some of the wider impacts that it could potentially have.
Is it my time now?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Ker-Lindsay, for that overview of the geopolitical and legal issues on the Chagos Islands, and also the interesting how it could affect Cyprus. I hadn't thought of that. Okay, and now I'd like to invite Olivier Bancoult to talk to our audience about his perspective as one of the exiled Chagosians. Olivier?
First of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk on behalf of my people who had been illegally uprooted from our motherland. As you know, we were people living in peace and harmony in Chagos Archipelago, mainly Chagos, Peros, Banos, and Solomon, until when they decided to have a U.S. military base on one of the main islands, Chagos. But I have to share with you, even Chagos, Mauritius was under British colony. Chagos was a dependency of Mauritius. It's clear that everyone should understand that on our birth certificate, it mentioned that we were born in Chagos, Peros, Banos, or Solomon, in dependency of Mauritius. But I have to draw your attention also that on the 8th November 1965, when the UK government declared Chagos as the last British overseas territory, British Indian Ocean territory, it did not consider Chagosian as British citizen. I have to mention what happened in 1999 when they decided, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee decided to give full British citizen to all British overseas, the dependent territory, overseas territory. This case had been heard, and when my friend James talked about Cyprus, it was only two of the islands have not been considered to have full British citizen: Cyprus and British Indian Ocean territory. We have been fighting for our rights because it's so important for every human being to be able to live in peace and harmony as we used to live in our birthplace. But unfortunately, the way of deporting people was very, very shameful for a country who's supposed to be a champion of human rights. What happened? There is two things that I have to mention. First of all, we have a violation of Charter of United Nations against Mauritius. And we have a violation of the fundamental rights of Chagosian people who had been expelled from the place of birth. It is how we have been starting. Life was very wonderful for us. We have our house, we have our job, we have our tradition, we have our culture. Only to satisfy US, they decided to approve people from Chagos first, and then later on from Peros, Banos, and Solomon. And it's something that we as people could not accept, because I myself, I've been uprooted at the age of 4. The reason why my sister was ill, and when my mom go to the dispensary on Peros, Banos to have treatment for my sister, the nurse advised my mom that she had to travel to Mauritius. Why Mauritius? Mauritius was the only link for Chagosian people. All the provision coming from Mauritius to come to Paris, Banos, Solomon, and Jagugasha. There is no other way to feed people. You see, this is why there was a link between Mauritius and Chagos. When we arrived in Mauritius, 3 months after my sister passed away, and when my mom and dad, the view was clear that we give priority to the treatment of my sister and be back to Chagos because all our belongings will have there. Unfortunately, that never happened because we were obliged to live in Mauritius. And it was so difficult for us to integrate ourselves in Mauritian society because the type of living that we have in Chagos is very different. First of all, the time of job, we all work in copra industries. This kind of work did not exist in Mauritius. And our weakness, most of our people don't have a level of education. It's not a way. And finally, let me share with you, brothers and sisters. I've got my opportunity to learn, to study in Mauritius, making my primary school and secondary school. Until one time I decided, with the support of my mom, to say that I have to join the struggle. I have a very big respect for Chagosian women who started the struggle because they take the lead to say that we cannot accept that our children go to bed without having something to eat. They started, like you did mention, about Solij Alexi, Lisette Talat, and my mom. I personally joined the struggle at the age of 80 in 1982 after my secondary school. And I'm getting more and more involved. And at that time, I started to know who prohibit me to return. As you know, brothers and sisters, we are all human beings. There is a universal declaration of human rights who clearly said in Article 9 that everyone has the right to live on his birthplace. And if we have a look in all organizations which anyone want to take part, you need to want to be a member, you need to abide to the rules and regulations. We can't understand how the UK government, together with US government, decided to violate the law that they had been voted concerning Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And let me tell you, brothers and sisters, until when we just decided to know exactly who brings this order, it was an order of 1971, British Order 1971, to procure our right to return to Chagos, even those who were born there, except British soldiers and US soldiers. I was the person who wanted to challenge that. I get in touch with solicitors and lawyers in UK. We find out at that time, we also been very lucky to have all the documents which were been classified at the Public Record Office, been keeping in secret for so many years, become into public. And we find out the way that the UK government considers Chagosian, to say that they were Tarzan and men on Friday, they were seagull, they were contractual workers. All it's a way of making frustration on Chagosian people, making as if we did not know about our rights. It's a shame. It's a shame for UK government to act on that. And we always try to be able to deal with them, to find out, to say that it's time to put an end to our suffering. You say you cannot return back the clock, but you can just correct all wrong that you did. How could we accept that there is a treatment for Falkland people, there is a treatment for Taik and Caicos, there is a treatment for St. Helena and all other British overseas territory, not for Chagosian? How could we accept that? How could we? There is a discrimination to our people. We have never asked. I understand that the U.S. military base on Diego Garcia is for a security reason. But we cannot understand how it is impossible for us to live. Brothers and sisters, let me share with you. We have our parents buried there. Even we are different faith, we always have a thinking for all our beloved parents who are never in this world. How could we not going to pay tribute to those people, to our parents? It's something unacceptable. This is why we as Sagosian, what we are asking about our dignity as human beings, about our fundamental rights. This is the reason. And let me tell you, the issue has been brought into the General Assembly of United Nations by Mauritius as a state. And it's clear that the matter has been referred to the International Court of Justice. And what is the coming up of the advisory opinion? It's clear that what has been done to Sagosian is unlawful. And we cannot say, we can't accept this kind of decision, this kind of position that they adopt toward the Sagosian. This is why we say we want to return. And in this world we are living, no one ignores where they come from. It's the case for us. Our children always heard about the place where we were born, but they never got the chance to go and visit the place. This is why it's more important for us, instead of going to settle in UK, instead of continue living in Mauritius, why not giving us our possibility as all human beings to breathe the air of where we come from, to breathe the air of where we were born, as all human beings, even we are black people coming from African origin. We are all have the same color of blood. And we should be treated as all human beings. This is the way that we're still finding. And I can say, today our struggle is a hope for all displaced people, because we are very determined to continue our struggle. And we say that our struggle is a just cause. We don't want more, we don't want less, but we want, as all human beings, to have our dignity and our fundamental rights being respected. And if you have other question, I will be pleased to share with you after when we have question and answer. Thank you, and I can just.
Okay. Oops. Well, thank you, Olivier, for giving us the Chagosian exiles perspective on the issue. Okay, and now we are entering the Q&A portion of the session. Now let's see, how do we manage this? All right, so in your reaction, there's a way to raise your hand. You can click raise hand, and that way we will, that's how we'll take the questions. If you raise your hand, I'll ask you to ask your question. All right, let's see if this works. Okay, and of course, unmute yourself before you ask your question. Okay. All right. Are there any questions for our speakers? All right, Pamela, you want to ask a question, right? You're muted, Pamela. Wait. Host tools. That's wait. You're still. Pamela, can you unmute yourself?
I got it.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Thank you. Now there's a big box in front of me. I have to admit, I just saw this briefly and didn't read much about it, and I was going to, so I'm sort of on a learning curve here, trying to understand about the issue. Do the Chagosians want to stay with Britain in some way as part of the Commonwealth, or do they want to have total sovereignty over their island? Or I'm not too sure. Like, I'm sorry, I came in late and I had my granddaughter running around, so I was sort of not, and just trying to learn about this. I'm sorry that not versed in this, but I'm just trying to learn about it.
Yeah. Can I reply to that?
Yes.
Yeah,
Very-
the position of the Chagosian was very clear. We always want to be on the side of British government. And unfortunately, the UK government never shouldered the responsibility towards Chagosian people, leaving them alone. Let me tell you about the white paper. I just may repeat what happened in 1999. That the case of Chagosian, our British Near-Ocean territory and Cypriots, did not take in consideration to our British citizens because they said they are used for defense purposes. And how could we be with a government who ignore our fundamental rights, who continue to banish our rights? And what we did, this is why the reason we do. We, up to now, it's not our intention to ask for independence. We are totally agreed to be under a central government, but we want to have our autonomy where we will have our own representative saying all that we want to do. This is what we are planning to do. We are working with Mauritian government to do that.
I hope that you get what you want there and that people can move back to where they were. I was in Cyprus for 3 weeks in 2017, but that's as close as I've been to this. But thank you for educating me on that. I hope that they are listening to you and that this can be resolved.
Okay, thank you for your question, Pamela. And I see Maxwell has clicked on the raise hand icon. So Maxwell, please ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for allowing me to answer this question. I don't think Mr. Bancoult is quite right to say that the Chagosians want Mauritius to have sovereignty on the islands. Now, the reason being is if you look at the ICJ court, the ruling says that they will resettle Chagosian of Mauritian origin. Chagosian are indigenous people which have their very own culture, like Mr. Bancoult correctly pointed out. They are a unique population, and a referendum has not been done for the Chagosians, so the Chagosians have never had their voices heard. And I would be in agreement with all Chagosians to be able to have their say on what they will do. And in a democratic society, we would allow the majority to decide this. This is the point I want to make: is the Chagosians is not one Chagosian who should make this decision. Is for all Chagosians. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Maxwell, for your comments. Olivier, do you have a response to that? Wait, Olivier, you're muted. Olivier, you're muted. Let's see. Let me fix this. Okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, you can hear you now. Okay.
Yeah. The decision of the ICJ is not a decision of Chagosian. It's a decision of 14 judges who said clearly that the sovereignty is for Mauritius. If there is a way of challenging that, let's go. This is why. And I have to let you know, those who are opposed to the return of Chagosian to Chagos are more of the third and fourth generation. I'm talking on behalf of the Chagosian native. I've been someone who's been decided for them. It's not on my own. I'm first of all, I'm Chagosian, but most of the Chagosian, not only in Mauritius, in UK, and even in Seychelles, are totally giving me the right to ask on their behalf to say that we want to return. And we are totally agree with the decision of the ICJ to give sovereignty to Mauritius.
Okay, thank you, Olivier, for your response. Okay, and I'll see if there's anyone else with a hand up. Oh, James, yes.
Yeah, what I'd say is that we get into really difficult and difficult to hear territory when we talk about this, because we talk of self-determination a lot in international politics and international law, but in actual fact, it's come to have two very, very specific meanings and very different meanings. Without getting too technical, it's what we call external and internal self-determination. So you'll very often hear people say, we have a right to independence because it's self-determination. No. So the way it works is that colonial territories had a right of self-determination leading to independence. Within countries, it's accepted that groups have a right to what we call internal self-determination, which is the right to social, economic, and political development, but within the state, i.e. a degree of self-rule. Now, what actually happens is that in cases of decolonization, at the moment that a new state comes into existence, the people within that state then lose their right to what that external self-determination leading to independence, and instead they get that internal self-determination. The reason this matters is because this has been remarkably effective, and this explains why Africa, despite its colonial heritage, which drew arbitrary lines on maps, has actually been remarkably stable. There have been incredibly few border conflicts in Africa. And it's partly because all the African states accept this idea that the moment they became independent, those borders were locked in. And what it means is that in the case of the Chagos Islands, is the court has effectively said, these were separated off from Mauritius. We accept that Mauritius should have sovereignty over them. And so that means that Mauritius will say, and so the Chagos Islanders don't have a right to independence because Chagos Islands should have been part of Mauritius when Mauritius became independent. And as such, then they would have a right of internal self-determination or autonomy, in other words. So it's a very, very different and difficult position that they're in, because Mauritius will turn around and say, well, no, you can't have independence because you should have been part of our territory anyway. And so just in a nutshell, that's the difficulty they face. I mean, there are also questions about, potential, the viability of the islands. They would be incredibly sparsely inhabited, a very small population that would go back. I mean, the smallest independent state at the moment, if I remember rightly, is Nauru, which is around 10,000. And that really is pushing the boundaries of what we would understand to be a viable state. So there would be very, very serious questions about that. So that, in essence, is the difficulty that is posed by all of this. Even if the Chagosians were to say, "Listen, we want independence," it would then now be a question of how they negotiate it with Mauritius, and there seems very little indication that Mauritius would allow this. And this is one of those great paradoxes, if you like, of international relations, that how many countries fight for their independence, but the second they have it, they cling on to their sovereignty and completely deny that right of self-determination and independence to those living within their borders.
Okay, thank you for that perspective on the issue. And I'll look for if there's anyone else. Oh, yes, Derek, you want to ask a question. So if you could unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now. Am I? You can hear what I'm saying? Okay, very good. My question is, all this is really nice, and all this is really esoteric, highfalutin, who has a right to what? Great. My question is, because I tend to be a little more down to earth, assume that the Chagos Islanders get the right to independence and the right to go back to the islands. what are you going to do for a living? Work on the base, if you can keep the base. Tourism? I don't know what the fishing's like, but what are you going to do on those atolls for a living? International handouts? I hope not. What you going to do for a living?
Can I reply to that, please? There is many plans for Chagos because we already work on it. We have even have a plan of returning, how to return. First of all, of course, it's clear that it should be livable.
Right.
The island should be livable with all infrastructure and housing for people. And of course, there is many ways. Let me tell you that we have 3,005 hectares of coconut trees on all the island. And we are surrounded by the sea, where we are, as you know, we have about 650,000 miles of maritime zone, where, and you know, about fishing industries. It's a way that the Chagos have a very good, and of course, we have to be careful about protection of our environment, because the time we used to live on Chagos, we were the real guardian. We want to rest assured. This is why that we were opposed to the plan of the marine protected area of the UK government, who just ignore the participation of the Chagosian people. And now, what we say, it should be included. And of course, we have to serve God. All the place, as I said, we have our cemetery, we have our church. Everything has been abandoned. We need to just put out, started something, a new life, and at the same time, give opportunity to all those who have never heard, know about Chagos, need to do so. The reason why we say this should be in Diego Garcia also. Even we have a US military base. If there is cohabitation among other people who work on Diego Garcia, like Filipinos, Singaporeans, Sri Lanka, Mauritian, everyone, why not for Chagos? It should be giving priority to Chagos who wish to go and work there. And those people who are working on the base as skilled workers, they have the right to live on Diego Garcia. Why not for us? This is what we are claiming.
Of course. And you have the right to do that. And the answer was very good. However, if I were an islander and said, okay, you can come back, and there I am, standing on the edge of the helicopter leaves. I got my suitcase and my potted plant and picture of the wife and kids. Where do I get a job? On the base? Where do I do what I'm, I got to pay for food this week.
No, you should, I just said to you, the island should be livable. If a permission had been given for to have a resettlement on Perez, Banos, and Solomon on the first time, and continue that the same issue, same things need to be happen on Diego Garcia. Okay? When we went there, it's not a way of going with a suitcase like this. Of course, we have to create jobs. There is a way of creating jobs. I'd mentioned you about coconut. I'd mentioned you about fishing industries. There is a way of starting something in Diego Garcia, in Perez, Banos, and Solomon on the first time. And of course, this will continue. Instead of having all the provision from the US Army, from Singapore, why not with Chagos?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Olivier, for that response. And thank you, Derek, for the question. And I'm going to move along to the next question. Actually, I have two questions of my own, right? And one's more personal and one's more geopolitical. I'll ask the personal one first. Olivier, I do believe you were amongst the people who made the first Chagosian trip back to the islands without the supervision of the British military or the American military. You mentioned that when the Chagosians were exiled, they left a lot of the infrastructure behind, like houses and churches. The cemeteries of your ancestors are there. When you got back there, what condition were they in? Is anyone upkeeping the old infrastructure, the old historic buildings and the cemeteries?
Unfortunately, it was never the case. This is why we are very upset with UK government together with US government. They always say that we need to promote culture. But how could we consider that the grave of our parents who buried on Diego Garcia Perez Banos and Salomon, let's abandon for so many years without any innovation, without anything doing in order to upgrade the place? And let me share with you what happened on Diego Garcia in a place called Cannon Point. We have a cemetery of military dogs who are well kept, comparing to the grave of our parents who have been abandoned. How could we accept that? How could we just say promote culture? But what about our culture? This is why. Is it something wrong when we ask for our rights? No one, we should respect the decision of any people. Those who want to settle in UK, they are right to do so. But those who want to go to settle, to return back to Chagos, we should have respect for them. It's their way of living. No one in this world knows their roots. This is why we want to return to our home. It's one full stop.
Okay. All right, thank you, Olivier, for that response. And my next question is more geopolitical. In the last 72 hours, the incoming Republican administration on the United States has seemingly just learned about the agreement between Mauritius and the UK. So now we have Marco Rubio and Trump and a senator from Louisiana named John Kennedy, no relationship to the famous Kennedy family, speaking about the handover of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Either speaker, do you have any comments on how the sudden American awareness and the incoming new administration may affect the situation? Okay, James.
Well, I'll go first on this one. I mean, the big question in many ways is there is a real worry about Chinese outreach in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this has been one of the questions that, and within quarters in the UK, which were very upset about this agreement, was the fact that whether the Mauritian government is under the influence of Beijing and what the wider significance of that could be. I mean, this will have also been coming to the thinking about how to deal with the legal status of the islands. So essentially, as you'd mentioned at the beginning, Derwin, I mean, the agreement that seems to have been reached, there isn't a final treaty that anyone can have a look at. It's in the process of being negotiated, is that Britain will retain control for 99 years. And it's a very interesting phrasing that they use, that it will exercise sovereignty in Mauritius's name for that period. So effectively, what it's saying is that it's almost a bit like a leasehold. I'm not sure if you have that concept in Canada, but it's one that obviously sort of exists in the UK. That effectively you own it for a period, but not forever. It's not yours. So essentially, the wording of the agreement looks like Britain will be able to do whatever it wants on Diego Garcia, not the other islands, but certainly on Diego Garcia, from what we can tell, and it will exercise sovereignty in the name of Mauritius. So essentially, it's saying, look, we will nominally hand back sovereignty or hand over sovereignty to Mauritius, but in effect, we will remain completely in control, and we will run Diego Garcia on our terms as we see fit. So what that's going to mean for the Chagos Islanders is another big question. But I think this is very much geared towards this idea of just trying to make sure that anything that happens in Mauritius, if it were to come under Beijing's influence, is not going to have a knock-on effect in terms of the operation of this incredibly important naval and air base on Diego Garcia.
Yeah, I would have to share something to say that our main focus is about the right of people. Everyone in this world has the right to live on his birthplace. And the question for Chagosian, how would it not be possible for us? I think that everyone should concentrate on that. For many years, our right has been banished. We have to go to court in UK and even international. Now, when the UK government decided to correct the injustice, to allow those who want to settle in Solomon and Peros Banos and the first time, something that we accept it. Instead of having nothing, we think that the same right should be given to people born on Diego Garcia. The reason why, as I said, we have never opposed to the presence of the US military base on Diego Garcia. What we said, if there is cohabitation, why not for Chagosian? I give you one example. Everywhere where we have a US military base, we have cohabitation. One example of Okinawa, where we have more than 32 bases, but we have cohabitation of people. One of the known, well-known, most secret base of US outside the United States is Guantanamo. Even in Guantanamo, we have people living there. How could we, just using my place of birth for a US military base, we understand for security. What we said, leave and let us leave. Priority should be given to Chagosian people because they have the right. They have the right to just to pay tribute to the parent buried there. They have the right to just keep well maintain the church and all the grave of their grandparent buried there. How could this be prohibited? This is the reason why we are staying. Our priorities should be given to everyone to have access to where they come from.
Right. Thank you, Olivier, for that response. And thank you, James, for your comments too. We're going to go to our last questions now. I see Jordan. Jordan, you've got a question, Jordan, right? Jordan?
Yes, I do. I was just activating my video.
Right.
I had a question. How did the Chagosians get along with the British during World War I and World War II? For example, did any of them work on the naval base there, or were civilians free to traverse the naval base? Or were there any Chagosian veterans? Is there a precedent in the past for how we could move forward today?
As far as we know, that there were no Chagosian who were engaged in the World War I and World War II. We were on a remote island. It was only just care for our security at the time. As far as I know, and just been asking for people more older than me, that we have never had someone participating in the World War I or World War II.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Olivier, for that response. And we are reaching the end of our time. Okay. And thank you all who asked a question. And I'm going to share screen again now. Let's see. Let's see. How do I do this? Let's see. Okay. Right. So for our audience, I encourage you to visit the website of the Chagos Refugees Group. There it is, the chagosrefugeesgroup.com. That's the website for the group that Olivier leads. And there you will find the perspective of the Chagosian exiles and their plea to be allowed the right to return home. And so please check it out. Also, you can also check out the YouTube channel of Dr. James Ker-Lindsay. It's a fascinating series of videos on international relations, conflict, security, and statehood. Okay. So those are two places on the internet that I encourage you all to visit soon. Okay. And thank you all for attending. This concludes our session on the Chagos Islands. I do believe this is the first time the Royal Commonwealth Society Toronto branch has managed to hold an event with people from 3 different continents participating at the same time. So we've made an RCS first today. Okay.
Okay, I just had this opportunity to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about the story of my people. And it's a very big privilege to share with you and to give more awareness about what wrong had been done to Chagosian, what had been illegally removed, deported from their birthplace.
Right. Thank you. James, do you have any other end comments?
No, just also to say, thank you very, very much for, inviting me to come and talk on this. I mean, it's a really important case. It hasn't received nearly as much attention as it should have done over the years, but one would hope now that some sort of justice will finally be delivered to the people, because they were treated, very, very shabbily. There's no doubt about it, uprooted from their ancestral homes, and it's been a rather shoddy chapter in all sorts of cases, and I think very often, and I suspect that it's been lost sight of the islanders themselves. So it's been fantastic to hear Olivier's point of view today. So thank you to all of you for putting this together.
Okay, right. Thank you, James. Okay, and that concludes our session. Remember, visit the Royal Commonwealth Society Toronto website as well. Find us on social media. And that concludes our session. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.